researchers, and above all, good morning overseas, above in Latin America. Bienvenidos. I will introduce the speakers and our scope in about 10 minutes, and then our first speaker, Dr. Helen, will start right away. So I thank you very much for your interest and for joining us in this endeavor to adapt to the new circumstances for empirical research, key in the context of the leading house for the Latin American region's funding instruments. Most of us depend on traveling and working face-to-face in close contact with people. In the Latin American region, this is even more vital and a more extended process sometimes in order to build up trust. Emails and telephone calls are just not enough. Thus, how can we resolve this in our new era, which will keep us busy for quite some time? Most probably, we will never do research again as in pre-COVID times. The virus and the virtual tools necessary to cope with it will continue to shape our work. Thus, in today's meeting, we are not only addressing emergency measures for fieldwork, but looking at possible long-term transformations of empirical research. Dear researchers, data protection, we will record this event for people who cannot attend today. If you do not wish to appear in the recording, please have your camera turned off at all moments. I would like to thank our team co-hosting this event. It's Leticia Vargas Bento, who organized the event and takes care of the timing today. Rocio Robinson will moderate your comments and questions in the chat. Please feel free anytime to use the function. Florian Wieser and Andrea Güpfert will give technical and other support. The reason for organizing this event has been to learn about different methods which might support and ease our remote research. Thus, we will take advantage of our two invited experts and ask them about methodological alternatives and tools. For several months, the virus has kept researchers paralyzed and stuck sometimes due to travel restrictions and other COVID measures, which is why I started to search the internet for solutions. We badly need them in order to find out how to solve the problem and support our leading house grantees. To my surprise, I discovered a lot of several researchers, for instance, in Australia, who long before COVID worked on such alternatives. Due to, for instance, in Australia, to big distances in their country, which made them practice remote fieldwork and virtual empirical formats long before the pandemic. Obviously, in tiny Switzerland, the process has been slower than in Australia, but now we will definitely have to adapt to a new context too. In order to prevent researchers from frustration, we need to innovate methods and be able to do without travels in the near future and with less travels in a distant future. In this line, we wish for the utmost flexibility of funding institutions following the paradigm shift empirical research with fieldwork is going through. We will share several links when sending you today's recording. If you wish, please send us a message. Some of the research methods compiled by Professor Deborah Lupton of University of New South Wales in Sydney in a crowdsourced document initiated by her are, for instance, in digital ethnography. The corresponding methodological list is long already, and you can find it on the internet. Christine Hein, professor at the University of Surrey, wrote a book on virtual ethnography in the year 2000 already. Or Larissa Hjort and other authors have edited the book, The Routledge Companion to Digital Ethnography, in 2017, focused on mobile practices. Among the remote methods, only to give you a sense, you can find photo, video, voice elicitation, video observation and calls, reenactment videos, online discussion platforms, the story completion method, orthoethnography, netnography, virtual methods using podcasts, experimenting with online live action role play, arts-based project combined with Skype interviews, of course, researching social media platforms, digital mapping and geospatial technologies, live streaming apps. Now, today we have with us two colleagues from UK, Dr. Helen Cara, and one of the pioneers in the field, Professor Bill Gaver, as we wish for a practical output of today's conversation as interactive as possible. The speakers will only take 15 minutes as the first part of their talk, and then right away start exchanging ideas with us all. Later on, they plan to present a second block of 15 minutes. They might present that one, followed again by a Q&A. Each will cover 60 minutes in total, with a short 10-minute break in the middle of our event. Please just pop in, unmuting your microphone when asking or commenting live. Only if we have several or many persons wanting to share, raise your virtual hand first. So let's jump right into the subject with Dr. Helen Cara, independent researcher since 1999, quite impressive, and as such has made it as a fellow into the Academy of Social Sciences. By training, she's a social psychologist with a BA from London School of Economics and an MA in social research methods from Staffordshire University. If I'm well informed, she's based in Uttoxeter near Staffordshire. Her research focus lies on health and social care, and especially on research methods, as you can tell, for example, from her book published at Polity Press with the title Creative Research Methods in the Social Sciences, a Practical Guide. Helen states that creative can lead to more ethical research methods, helping researchers to address social injustice, for instance, based on 4 pillars: arts-based research, research using technology, mixed method research, and transformative research frameworks. She refers to interactive fieldwork, multimedia, WhatsApp multimedia, video clips, structured diaries, digital storytelling. Thus, we thank you very much, dear Helen, for sharing your current, also practical insights with us. We also thank our second speaker for the other half of the event, Professor Bill Gaver from Goldsmiths University of London, Professor of Design and co-director of the Interaction Research Studio at Goldsmiths, specialized in design-led methodologies and innovative technologies, situated at the crossroads between social science, cognitive science, as well as art and design, computing, or sociology. His design-led research focused on so-called cultural or design probe tools, a design-driven research technique to analyze people's lives, values, activities, thoughts, opinions, etc. These probes mean small packages, kits, including different artifacts, for instance, a map, a postcard, a camera or diary, visuals, podcasts, etc., multimedia, with which to record specific events, feelings or interactions in an empathetic or co-designing way, including participants' self-reporting, can definitely be applied to fieldwork and inspire reflective and playful participation. By training similarly to Helen, Bill earned a PhD at University of California, San Diego for psychology and cognitive science. Between 1994 and 2004, he had taught at Royal College of Art, London, as a professor of interaction research, where he studied methods to use technology for social and cultural intervention, thus at a very early stage. So, dear Bill, we are very much looking forward to your talk too, but first it's my great pleasure to hand over the floor to Dr. Helen Cara. Thank you.
as we say in the UK, I just fell at the first fence, starting to talk while muted on Zoom. You would think by now I would know not to do that, but clearly not. Thank you very much, Yvette, for that lovely introduction. And I hope to be able to enlighten you today and interest you. I will tell you that I have a bad fault. When I get a bit excited with my subject, I sometimes talk too fast. If I start talking too fast, please look at your reactions and send a little one of those into your window, little open mouth, and I will know to slow down. Okay, because yeah, I don't want to go too fast and lose everybody with my enthusiasm, which is what can happen. So I'm going to share my screen now, and I will come back from that when we get to the discussion time so that I can talk to you more face to face. But for now, I will share my slides, and this should work. Oops, a daisy, there you go. So if someone can just tell me, did that work okay? Can you see? Yes, thank you, Yvette. I'm getting a thumbs up, that's lovely. I'm just resizing the window so I can see all of you in case anybody needs to tell me I'm talking too fast. Great. So Yvette introduced my Creative Methods book, first edition, which is not surprising. The second edition only came out about 2 months ago, but the title has changed a little. To start with, the first edition was Creative Research Methods in the Social Sciences. It should have been in the Social Sciences, Arts and Humanities, but that was too long. But now we just took away the subtitle because for the second edition, 2020, it's Creative Research Methods across the board, including STEM subjects. In fact, there were some STEM subjects in the first edition, but anyway, that's what happened. So we're now also including embodied research as one of the now 5 pillars, alongside arts-based multimodal research using technology and transformative research frameworks. But today I'm not talking to you about that book, I'm talking to you about these books. These are 3 ebooks, digital books, rapidly produced by Policy Press, who published some of my other books also. And in May, I wrote a post on my blog about methods that I thought would be useful in a pandemic. And I included autoethnography and digital methods and something else I can't remember now. My editor at Policy Press reads my blog, and she emailed me and said, would you like to edit a collection for us that we can produce rapidly to help researchers, because we know people are struggling with this. So I recruited my excellent co-editor, Su Ming Koo from the National University of Ireland. We thought we might get 15 good chapters if we were lucky. We actually had over 100 responses to our call for chapters, even though it had 2.5-week deadline, really tight timescale. And most of them were such good quality that we now have published 3 of these digital ebooks, and we have a print book with different chapters coming out next year. The ebooks really focus on the pandemic. The print book takes a wider view of research in times of crisis, including other kinds of crisis, earthquakes, famine, all sorts of things that can hit, droughts, fires, all of those things. So each of these volumes has 11 chapters, and they include researchers from all over the world, including some examples from Latin America, I'm pleased to say. I'll be saying a bit about those later. So the case studies that I'm going to share with you today are from these books. One's from the print book, mostly from the ebooks. We learned that researchers all over the world are being so creative in their responses to the restrictions that are placed on us. Restrictions cause problems for sure, but they also bring opportunities for creativity and opportunities for different ways of working. And researchers right around the world have risen to these. Yes, we have some from Australia, as Yvette mentioned, because their country is so huge, they have had to get to grips with all of this. But also from some very small countries like Fiji and Tonga. Anyway, let me move on. What we found is there are sort of 3 main types of research that happens in a crisis. Some is investigating the effects of the crisis itself. Some is research already happening that then continues. And some is research that will begin during a crisis, but is not about the crisis. So this is a bit like, there's a Shakespeare quote, some people are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. And it's a bit like that with these three types of research that we identified from all the different proposals that we read, submissions, chapter submissions. I'm not going to say much about ethics, but I did want to say that one question that kept coming up again and again was, when there is a crisis, when life is difficult, when people are more stretched, more tired, sometimes overwhelmed, we need to think more carefully about whether our research is justified at all in those circumstances. Clearly some is, but not all. And some people decided to pause research or to stop altogether until a different time comes to us. So that was repeated a lot in the submissions. It's worth thinking about, I think. And as for methods, just broadly, clearly there are some that you can't use in any crisis situation. There'll be ones in crises, but some we can't work face-to-face now with participants. Or at least only if you're 2 meters apart in the open air, which is not always easy to achieve. Sometimes we can adapt. If we were going to do interviews face-to-face, we can do them on Zoom instead. That's straightforward, and there are other adaptations that I'll talk about. But as I said, there is a lot of scope for being creative with how we respond to this situation. I've broadly divided this into creative methods for the first presentation and digital methods for the second, but there's not clear blue water between those two. The creative methods often are using digital methods as well, and the digital methods are often quite creative. So it's a really fairly artificial distinction, but we'll go with it for now. Oh, these should be in the right order I checked. Never mind. So 4 methods that I'm going to cover. These are the 4. I won't read them to you because I'm sure you can all read for yourselves. These are the 4 creative methods that I've chosen to cover in more detail. So story completion. This was used by researchers who were investigating how people in the UK and in New Zealand made sense of the restrictions that were placed on them because of the pandemic. And the restrictions were different in the different countries at different times. I will say that there are a range of disciplines of researchers. The researchers I'm talking about today come from a quite wide range of disciplines. The point of these methods, though, is that they're often transferable across and between disciplines for different research purposes. I don't think methods really belong to disciplines particularly. So what these researchers did was they made up 6 little, what they called story stems. So it would often just 2 or 3 sentences. It might be Freddie's friends invited him to go and have drinks with them in the park. When this wasn't allowed, what did Freddie do? That's not a real one, I made it up, but along those lines. And they asked their participants to complete of the stories, to finish, to say what Freddie did and what happened and particularly what he decided. They were very interested in what people thought the decisions and the implications of those decisions could be for these fictional characters. They asked each participant to complete 2 chosen at random. They got about 144. I think all but 3 wrote 2 stories. I think there were 3 who only wrote 1, but most of them wrote 2. And the researchers were surprised by the level of detail, by the richness of the stories that came back. And this is something perhaps to talk about. We might say, stories aren't true. Why would we use stories in research? We need facts. Why on earth would we turn to stories? I think there's a lot of truth in stories. Stories are used in education around the world, in communication, in all sorts of, in ritual, in our faiths that we may share or not share, but even so, then they have stories. And we can learn a lot from stories about what people think, what they believe, how they perceive the world around them. So that's why stories have a truth of authenticity. It's not a truth of factual reality, but it's a truth of authenticity. And when you have a lot of stories, you know, nearly 300 stories to analyze, you can get some really rich findings from that by looking at the themes and and then categorizing those themes and so on. So that was story completion. Then this is Louise Cusero working in the UK. This is doctoral research now. She was working to investigate the engagement of children aged about, I think, 7 to 11 or 7 to 12 with the new format of biographical stories of women that have begun to be marketed to children, like the Goodnight Stories for Rebel Girls and so on, including a page each for notable women through the ages. And she had a method all organized that she was going to just do interviews with young people, maybe use some artifacts, but of course she had to do work online. So she actually based her research on cultural probes. I'm not going to explain those because Bill will tell you all about cultural probes in the second half of this presentation. But what she created was a set of open-ended and arts-based activities that she could use online with children, ask children to do in their own time, and then bring her back the product of what they'd done or the products, and then they would discuss those in an online interaction. She made it a point of trying to make these interesting and fun, because particularly with children, that's important, but I would argue with adults too. Let's make research fun for our participants when we can. It's not always possible, but sometimes, you know, we can do that. And yeah, she did some reading and interviews online. Now, when she wrote the chapter for us, she had fully devised her method, but she hadn't yet tried it. So I asked her last week on Twitter, how's it going? Have you tried it? And she'd sent a lovely tweet back saying she's getting really great creative responses. You can see here, cakes, poetry, hand puppets, all sorts of things that people are doing and sharing. She's going to have a challenge at the analysis stage, but I'm sure she's figured out a way to deal with that. Then a very different approach. Someone's either unmiked or trying to talk to me. I think that was a voluntary unmic. So very different project here from a much more experienced researcher, a museum anthropologist working with material culture, investigating human material culture, which would usually involve going to museums and looking at artifacts, studying them, photographing them, writing about them, touching them, handling them, discussing them with other people. Of course, in the pandemic, that all stopped. So this was an Indigenous American researcher working in Australia with Indigenous Australian peoples, and they decided they could learn about material culture by making baskets, particularly in traditional ways. They found an Indigenous basket maker who could teach them online how to make these baskets, and they had online workshops and did making in between the workshops. And that way they learned about how the baskets were constructed and also were able to discuss what they might be used for and people's experiences of making and using these baskets and of inheriting baskets from other people. They did that every week. And that really deepened their insights into materiality and culture, enabled them to continue their research, albeit in a different way. And it also built a sense of community for these researchers and the Indigenous peoples who were working with them. They had a sense of, I think they were all women, and they really built, it helped to reduce the isolation and the loneliness that so many people have been feeling in this pandemic. And then another doctoral project, again from the UK, doctoral student and supervisor working together. This is Naomi Clark, is a doctoral student who was already doing a pretty creative doctoral piece of work based on crafting, making textile art and craft. And she noticed at the beginning of the pandemic in her Instagram feed that people were beginning to use making more as a way of coping with the isolation, with the stress, with the anxiety that they were experiencing. She found this really interesting, and she and her supervisor decided to collect stories of what people were making, why they were making it, how it benefited them, what it was for, all that kind of stuff. So she asked people who she was connected with on social media to send her photographs of what they'd made and a bit of explanation about it, and maybe to keep a diary while they were doing the making, which could be in any format, could be a fairly conventional written diary or video, audio, or even a stitched diary where each day you stitch a little panel about how that day has been. If you want to see an example of a stitched diary, I can put a URL in the chat during the break. They're quite interesting things. And they found that this again built quite an interesting little community, and Naomi and Debbie were very respectful and quite nurturing of their participants. So when a participant would send Naomi an email with a photograph of what they'd made and some of their diary or some narrative, she would look at it and read what they'd sent and send them an email back with her response of what she liked about it and how she was thankful to them for taking part. And sometimes they would have a bit of conversation. And again, it helped reduce isolation. It meant a lot. She just did it naturally because she's that sort of person, but then she realized that it had become part of her method and she was reflecting on it. So she was building that in. So that's really quick presentation, just over 15 minutes. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but first I will say, this is what I'm asking you. What do you think? Do you have any comments, any other examples, questions, reactions, arguments? Everything is welcome. And if you want to comment in the chat rather than verbally, I'm fine with that too. When I stop sharing, which I will do now, I'll be able to see the chat. There we go.
Thank you very much, Helen, for this first block. You really make us look tired here in Switzerland with your fast reaction and your ebooks, crowdsourcing, immediate research methods immediately with COVID. So, I mean, we're slowly starting to think about it, you know, so we were really fast and make us look tired. I think the community building is really a very important aspect of all the methods you have just commented due to isolation. So the floor is open for your questions and comments. You can just unmute the microphone or use the chat.
I have a quick question.
Yes,
amazing
please.
Presentation. Thank you very much, Dr. Cara, for your insights and your quick response. Oh my God, yeah, I agree with Yvette. I research in STEM fields, and you mentioned that you know, the book also extends to STEM fields. In my case, what I do is math. Basically, I am an experimentalist. I do experiments. I don't have a great facility here, but I collaborate a lot with the researchers around the world. Do you have any, I would say, recommendations for this type of research, which is a bit, you know, aside from social studies, that could use the methodologies that you have just explained? Thank you.
Very probably. I think experimental mathematics itself is quite a new branch of maths, isn't it? Maths was originally thought of as purely deductive, but now the experimental side is growing, and I think it's really interesting how that subfield is developing. Using creative methods like this in maths is harder. There will be, if you know, without going in more detail into exactly what you're doing, it's hard to. I find it hard to advise you. But one thing I can say, one example that I like, this, I'm not sure this is so much from experimental maths, it's more for a pure maths thing, but there's a maths thesis written by an American woman called Piper Harron, a doctoral student, which is very creatively written. It's very enjoyable to read. I've read it. She uses jokes, she uses comic strips. She writes some parts of her thesis in 3 different ways, the same material for lay people, then again for her peers, and then again for her professors and examiners. So she uses 3 different registers for those sections. Then there are a lot of equations, which are very pretty. I can't say I have read them because I can't read equations. My own mathematics skills are not advanced to that level. But they need a narrative. Everything needs a narrative. So one thing I can say where you can be creative with the maths research is when you're reporting it, when you're explaining it to people, because you can't just present a bunch of equations or a table of numbers without some narrative, some explanation. And there's a lot of scope for creativity in how you put that explanation across. I don't know if that's any help at all. I'll put her name in the chat. It's Piper Harron. So if you want to look online, you'll be able to spell it. But I would need to spend more time finding out what you're doing to give you more advice on that. Maybe you can just, oh, there's another thing, I suppose. Well, this is presenting really, but perhaps this would work with participants. Sometimes if you're wanting to look at proportions, using a substance that is relevant to the work you're doing. So I don't know, if you're researching maths around the amount of milk that cows produce, you might use a white liquid. It wouldn't necessarily have to be milk, because probably that would go off and be horrible, but you could just use, you know, chalky water in tubes to show the different proportions, and that can bring it to life a little bit. That's another thing I've seen done on the maths side of things. Oh, there's loads. There's a hyperbolic geometry. Hyperbolic geometry, there's a lovely case study there where a Latvian researcher called Daina Taimina was working in California at the University of California or Berkeley, I can't remember, one of those really, you know, high quality universities there. And she was working on a problem that had eluded people who do hyperbolic geometry literally for centuries. And this was how to model hyperbolic geometry. It's the geometry of frilly things. So like that kind of lettuce that's got frilly edges, or seaweed. And they had failed for centuries to model hyperbolic geometry. And Daina Taimina was sitting at home pondering this problem while she was occupying her hands with some crochet. And then she had a light bulb moment and realized that she could model using crochet. And now she crochets whole coral reefs. And that modeling method is now being used also in architecture. This is where things go across disciplinary boundaries. So there are a whole bunch of examples, but they're not specifically from experimental mathematics as yet, although I have written about experimental maths because it's so interesting.
It's a hard question, though. I mean,
hard question.
I would struggle, but you were totally right in saying that everything needs a narrative, and even mathematicians have to talk to each other. You know. So we have a question, Rocio.
Yep. So Dr. Cara, thank you very much for your presentation. We have one comment / question very much in tandem to what Christian asked. And then we have a very precise, specific second question. So the first one is from Patricia Nabucco, and it says, "Hi, Helen, very interesting presentation. I have a feeling that it was an easier adaptation for disciplines more open to creative methods. I feel that some disciplines would be more constrained to accept these methodologies, for example."
Yes, I think that would be fair. Also, I think some countries are more constrained to accept the methods. So for example, I have heard from two separate researchers from Latin American countries, I think one from Chile and one from Brazil, if I remember correctly, that they had to go to America, the US, before they could use autoethnography for doctoral study, because they couldn't find a supervisor in Chile or Brazil, respectively, who was willing to work with them. They were told it's not proper research. If you want to work with me, you have to do proper research. So it's not only disciplines. I think we have all been constrained. I mean, my first degree, my psychology degree, was a BSc. It was a research degree. It was purely quantitative, no qualitative research at all. I did, 3 years, and I enjoyed it. It was interesting. It was fine. But I didn't really learn about qualitative research till I did my master's, my MSc, which was half and half. So it's newer in some fields, and I think we're constrained by the dominance of biomedical research, which is primarily quantitative, although now there are many more medical researchers doing mixed methods research and some doing purely qualitative. And even within disciplines, there are ranges, because for sure, if you're doing drug trials, you need to do randomized controlled trials. That's really important. That's a great method. But if you're a public health researcher, you might very well want to do qualitative research to find out people's perceptions of smoking in the community, or obesity, or whatever the problem is that you're working on. So the constraints are I think not as simple as one discipline, yes, another no. There's scope for using randomized controlled trials in the arts. There's scope for using arts-based methods in engineering. There's a lot of crossover. I think people using creative methods are still, in a sense, pioneers. I still get messages from even people in Euro-Western countries saying, my supervisor won't let me use creative writing in my thesis. What do I do? These kinds of questions, which I have answers for. So I think it's more complicated than just some disciplines are more constrained, although I think that is also true, but it's overall a much more complex picture. But, events, discussions like these, books like mine and many other people's, including Bill, I'm sure, the work that we do is helping to challenge. And the point is not that creative methods are better overall. The point is that if we have both conventional and creative methods at our fingertips, it makes us better researchers, because the real bottom line is, when we're doing a research project, we need to think which methods will help us to answer our research questions, which methods will be most useful for this project, not the methods we like best or the methods we know best. Which methods at this time in this place or these places, which methods are going to help us most, which methods with our budget. There are a lot of considerations, and the more methods we can use, the better we can answer those questions and the better we can do research.
Thank you. We have a second question from Adine Gavazzi, and it says, thank you for the excellent presentation. Our chair researches on World Heritage sites and forest cultural landscapes. We need to be on the site to work, and there is no way to guarantee safety. Also, permits and fundings have been suspended. Any suggestion?
Okay, yes. And this is something I will come to, in fact, in the next part of my presentation. But I think you might find that there is a good role for secondary data. Obviously, it's not ideal, it's not what you would choose, but there is likely to be a lot of information online about World Heritage sites and about forest cultural landscapes. There are likely to be websites, there are likely to be images, there may be blogs by people who are writing about these things just because they're interested. And I think having a really good look around online and seeing how much you can use that information would probably be helpful for you, and it would certainly give you something to do that's relevant and might give you a whole other aspect to your research that you haven't considered. It might even help you more than you can know. And there's a lot of tourism information too. Travel and tourism, yes, there's not much happening, but there's loads. Again, there's blogs, there's sites. There was one tourism researcher who did a piece of work based on the responses to an online petition about whether or not a golf course could go in a certain area. I can't remember all the details of the research, but she found rich data in the public responses to a petition that were clearly visible online, and she harvested and analysed those, and that helped her with her research. This is long before the pandemic. This was about 10 years ago. So I would say, think laterally, look sideways and look online to see what you can find and how you might be able to use it. You might really be pleasantly surprised about how much stuff there is and how useful it could be.
Great.
Thank you.
Her comment in addition to that was that we are really open to everything and are now trying to digitalize the knowledge, and we have of the cultural heritage, but travel and tourism are totally down now. But I think you addressed that already.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Which is a good bridge.
Which
is a good bridge to your the second part of the talk on digital methods. But perhaps there is still a pressing one on creative methods.
Right. So the very last question we have here for the moment is: are there any examples of using such tools in basic research?
Can you just clarify what you mean by basic research? I'm not sure quite what you're asking me there. Elise, if you can perhaps...
I think Elise is there. Yeah.
Oh, engineering, physics. Oh, yes, absolutely, there is. Engineering, yes, lots. Engineers are very into making things and designing things. Physics, I don't know so much, but yes, there is actually. There's a woman called Karen Barad whose work I think is really interesting. She's a theorist rather than a researcher as such, but she began as a physicist, not a physician, that's a doctor. She began as a physicist, and she was a physics professor in America. And then she moved across to working on social theory. And she developed a social theory based on diffraction, which is the way that light or sound waves change when they hit an object. If you think about, if you drop a pebble into a calm pond, you get those ripples. And then if you drop another pebble in the ripples, as the ripples sort of cross each other, that's diffraction. And she applies that as a metaphor to society as a whole. Now, that's not research, but a lot of academic research is linked with theory, uses theory as a lens or as an organizing framework or as a way to help analyze data. And her theory has become very useful and is used by a lot of researchers in a lot of different disciplines. And she started off in physics and has brought that across. So engineering, absolutely. Physics, haven't come across much. Maths, fair few, quite a lot. Technology, loads. Computer science, masses. It does vary by discipline, but yes, there are lots of examples. I'm writing a book right now for Sage. The title is Qualitative Research for Quantitative Researchers, because quantitative researchers all around the world are now finding they need to learn more. It may be to do a bit of mixed methods research, or for any number of reasons, they're having to learn how to do qualitative research alongside the quantitative research that they know so well. So I'm currently collecting a whole load of new examples, new to me examples and more recent examples of these kind of uses. So yes, there are lots. And thank you for the clarification, that was helpful. Okay, I guess I should probably press on.
Yes.
And do part two. So I'm going to share my...
I was wondering, but we can talk about that later, that all the online communication as data replacing traditional in-person participant observation, which is now your second part, there might be disadvantage that the implication by the researcher lessens. So there is unasked and more natural communication, perhaps. So now we come to this digital part.
Okay, and I should say, I'm just sharing my screen again now, so I hope that's working okay. I should say that, thank you, that in the books, there are a number of quantitative and STEM examples. They're more, like there's one example, there's one really good chapter on how to increase survey responses when you're doing digital surveys, but they're more sort of kind of procedural. I thought that the examples I've chosen, I thought would perhaps be more interesting for today in terms of looking at the breadth of different approaches researchers from different disciplines have taken. So we've done that one. So let's look at digital methods. These are the ones I'm going to talk to you about. So we talked about secondary data a little in response to Adine's question. I'm going to talk about it a bit more now. This is another doctoral student, Paramjit Chawla, working in New Delhi. Her doctoral research was about the capabilities of young people in New Delhi, and she had planned to interview young people, and then of course she couldn't. And she turned to secondary data, which I think is not an obvious way to go, but she's done a really good job of looking for and finding relevant data that will enable her to answer her research questions. And of course, there is a lot of data online now. There is a lot of health data, government data, we talk about open data. There are repositories of data. Universities have them, institutions have them. Not everyone has access to all of them, but quite a lot are accessible quite easily. Having said that, she found, and I have heard this before, that it can be really difficult to find what you need. If you can find it, you can't necessarily have access, and that's very frustrating when you can see the data exists, but you can't get past the gatekeeper, or it costs a lot of money, which you don't have. And if you do manage to get hold of it, then you have to understand it, because this is data that was not created for your research. might not have been created for anybody's research. It might have been created for a completely different purpose. But it's good to use secondary data. Generally, anyway, I advocate starting with secondary data to see if you can answer your research question that way, and only moving to primary data if you really need to, because everyone gets fed up with being asked to take part in research. And as researchers, we have a responsibility here. I talked about making it fun, that's one way, but also just not asking people stuff we can find out for ourselves elsewhere. But secondary data does offer a lot of opportunities right now. And it's not just statistics. Statistics, of course, are hugely useful, and there's lots of them. They can set your research into context, but also qualitative data online, like from social media. We'll talk a bit more about that as we go. Then this is a much more complex and sophisticated project on gender and, oh, come on, Helen. I know what GAGE stands for, and now I've forgotten. Gender and adolescence, that's right, gender and adolescence in the Middle East and North Africa. And this was a longitudinal, well, it is still a longitudinal piece of research, been going on since 2015. But the researchers, it's in specifically Jordan, Lebanon, and the Gaza Strip in Palestine. So difficult environments at the best of times with the politics as they are at present. And of course, impossible now for researchers to travel there. The researchers are not based in those countries, or not all of them are. And even those who are can't travel within the country. So they had to move online. But they didn't just want to do online interviews. They wanted to do something more interesting, more engaging for their participants. So they did digital storytelling, which is a whole big complex method of its own that's used in a whole range of fields, where people use different ways to help participants tell their stories using digital means, video, audio, bringing in images, sound clips, giving their own narration, or using music, all sorts of different ways. With this, they used photos particularly. They asked participants to take photos. I think their participants had smartphones or tablets, devices that they could use, taking photos to tell stories then in online discussions, and also structured diaries, but with open-ended questions so people could write discursively however much or however little. And they didn't have to write again, they could do audio. It's about giving flexibility. A big message through a lot of these contributions is that giving participants options and choices is helpful at these times, because some people find it easier to write if they don't have much privacy to record, to speak. They might be overheard. That might constrain them in what they want to say. Others have difficulty writing. Maybe if they have dyslexia, but they can speak easily, then that's better for them. So participants could choose how they completed their structured diaries. And as well as flexibility, the researchers found this was easier for them because, of course, with it being longitudinal research, they knew their participants, they already had those relationships in place. It might be more difficult if you were coming new to a community to set something up like this. I'm not saying it would be impossible, but you might need to spend some time building relationships first. And there are various ways to do that with the tools we have available to us. Interesting one with WhatsApp. This was some research in rural Zimbabwe, looking at the impact of the pandemic, particularly looking at gendered and socioeconomic impacts on people in rural areas. And initially, the researcher here thought he would use Skype, but not all participants had Skype or were able to use Skype or felt comfortable with Skype or had the connectivity that enabled them to use Skype. Whereas WhatsApp, everyone in rural Zimbabwe, it turns out, or everyone this researcher wanted to talk to already had WhatsApp. So this was quite a bit of serendipity, a bit of inspiration that struck in the course of the research. And he found that this was a really useful platform. It enabled more than Skype because he could send requests to participants. They could respond when they had access to the internet. Maybe they were on someone's Wi-Fi or they had a bit of mobile data. and they could use voice notes. With WhatsApp, you can respond by voice or by text. And again, that gave them the choice, gave them the option. And if he got something in their response that he didn't understand, he could call them using WhatsApp again to ask, can I just check with you that I've got the right information here, that I've understood correctly what you wanted to say to me. And it was all free, so bonus. So that's a helpful platform, probably not for everyone, but certainly it was really helpful for him in his research. He was surprised to find how helpful it was. This is a much bigger piece of work in Europe. This is European funded research to look at university students understanding knowledge and perceptions of science. It was already set up. They had set up events. They call them science camps. They didn't really go in tents. They were in buildings, or they were going to be in buildings for half a day with experts speaking and with videos and with discussion to get information about how students thought of science. And they couldn't hold these events because the pandemic came. So they had to put them online. They were quite depressed because they were looking forward to the events and thinking maybe it wouldn't work too well online. Instead of one half day, they had 4 shorter sessions. And this is a bit of a message about working online. You can't really do very long things. Everyone gets too tired. They found that students really liked this method. They appreciated the chance to still be involved. They were glad that something was still happening with this project that they cared about, that they were interested in. And they also found, to their surprise, that they could reach a lot more students. They could take a bigger geographical coverage because there was no barrier of travel and cost and time. Students could join from further across Europe and give their impression. So actually, this thing that started out in depression turned out to be, in fact, probably better than the original conception. And I think it's interesting. I mean, Yvette alluded to this in her introduction. I think we were perhaps all too reliant on physically getting together. And heaven knows I miss physically getting together with people. And I wouldn't say let's never do that again, because there's a lot to be gained. But I think in the future, we will be more reflective and more careful. We've learned how to work online and how to manage this. And it does enable more people to join, more people to be involved. Sometimes people, from different places, time zones are a problem. I have tomorrow morning, I'm doing a seminar at 6 a.m. and I'm finishing online at 9 p.m. And that's to accommodate other people's time zones. It's going to be a long day. This happens. But, I'll be in South Africa in the morning and I'll be working with colleagues in Australia and America in the evening. We couldn't do that face to face. It would be not possible. So I want something that came up again and again in the contributions to the books was this thing about digital difficulties. We talk about the that needs muting. Can the host please mute that? I don't think I can do it. Can someone mute that iPhone? Thank you. Thank you very much. We talk about the digital divide. It's not a divide. That makes it sound binary. It's about access, and access is complicated. So Etevina Lovo, this is doctoral. She was studying research ethics in Tonga. She's from Fiji, and she was working with local communities. Fiji and Tonga are similar enough that she understood how the local community worked. She needed to speak to elders, and she had arranged meetings with them. And she knew how to dress, she knew the protocols, she knew what gift to bring and how to speak, how to address people, because this is her culture, these are her country, this is where she lives and works. But when she had to move online, it became very difficult because there was no protocol for working online with Indigenous elders. And she was worried about whether they would even agree to meet with her online, which some of them did, and whether she would, how she was worried about how to behave because she didn't know. It was suddenly an unfamiliar environment. She wrote a really interesting chapter reflecting on that. We've talked about the WhatsApp. I said that already. I don't know why these are in the wrong order. In Colombia, Natalia Reynoso and her colleague were working on, I think, migration. I think I've got that right. And they were working across quite a wide area of the country with a lot of different groups of people. And they found there was difficulties because, I mean, okay, technically you can move things online, but some of their potential participants didn't have internet access, or had access but didn't have the skills to use the internet because it wasn't familiar to them, or they were of an older age group, so they didn't use the internet where perhaps younger people would do. And again, they had difficulty communicating with indigenous communities in Colombia, many of whom were not familiar with the internet as a way of communicating at all. So yeah, this kept coming up again and again. Those of us who have access, have the skills, have the connections, have the hardware, sometimes we feel as if we can do everything online, but we can't. It limits us, and we need to be aware of that. About digital, we talked about the people in Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. They found for some of their adolescent participants had difficulty because some didn't have the privacy even to write a diary or to keep a diary that they were confident could be kept apart from people in their household. So that was difficult. Really, flexibility is the key, but also clearly being able to work online does solve problems for some people. Raphael Goldstein and his colleagues working with waste pickers in Sao Paulo in Brazil, very marginalized community, and they haven't solved their problem because waste pickers don't have much money, don't tend to have smartphones, so they can't be contacted. The research team had a budget. They would have liked to give smartphones to their participants, but that would have meant physically meeting them, which was not sensible because of the pandemic. So they have moved to using secondary data, looking at what's online, looking at past interviews, reanalyzing previous data in different ways, in more depth, for the time being, until they can actually get back to working with people directly. Of course, many of us are connected, but we have to remember those who are not. And as well as who we're including, we have to think about who we're leaving out and be aware of that. So back to discussions, same thing. So I'll stop sharing and be a person again instead of a slide.
Yes, may I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Can you, Marcos, can you come closer to the microphone? We don't hear you properly.
Oh, hello, is that better?
Yeah, go on.
Okay, Professor Cara, you are dealing with diaries, stories, narratives here. So I wonder if in the universe you are sketching out, if there's any room for generalization. So first, is generalization an issue? And if so, how do you tackle it?
Okay, that's a good question. I think that researchers are increasingly realizing that generalization has limited possibility in the world of research. It was a concept we were all very attached to for a long time, but actually each piece of research exists in a particular location and time, a place, a time, and a context which can't be replicated. This doesn't mean there's no room for replication in research, and for generalizability, there is, but it's more limited than we used to think. I think, for example, the work on story completion in the UK and New Zealand, the fact that that was in two very different countries gives scope for possibly generalizing some of those findings to other countries that have some similarities with those countries. Not to all countries, but to some that maybe are primarily English speaking, vaguely Euro-Western. I mean, they're very different countries because the UK is the land of the stealers of land, and New Zealand is a settled and colonized country with an indigenous population. So there's a big difference there, but I think there would still be scope for some generalization there. Again, with diaries, with young people in Jordan, Lebanon, Palestine, you could perhaps justify a suggestion that you could possibly generalize the findings of that research more widely within the Middle East. So countries like Syria, Israel, those kinds of countries you might find, Egypt, parts of Egypt, certainly you might find similar findings there. But full generalization everywhere, I think that's very difficult. I think that's very difficult generally in a lot of research that's mixed methods or qualitative. I think really it's limited to things like, as it were, drug trials. You know, those are very much on everyone's mind at the moment, of course, with what's going on in the world. I think that's probably why that example keeps coming to my mind, because the newspapers are full of vaccines and so on. I hope that helps.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you,
welcome.
Helen and Marcus. I think it's really important that you mentioned that there might be a fatigue of interviewees, so to unburden them and to create haptic reactions or visual reactions with photographs, with objects, is probably really a good relief. Because it might be, I mean, yeah, there is a fatigue for sure of the interviewees if everything goes digital, you know. And I was surprised, I mean, that the crowdsourcing, I mean, we're really grateful that you present us all these examples. You have crowdsourced globally, and I think that's also a consequence of COVID. So this crowdsourcing examples and articles and projects and solutions, digital solutions, this is really great. I mean, you go just all over the world and give us these examples with your ebook. So that's, I think, is an interesting consequence too. So we have one or two comments and questions on the chat, or is there any live questions still?
I could just say that you've been said very, I think I'm very proud of these ebooks, but really the credit goes to the contributors. You know, these are researchers working so hard. The response, we were blown away by the quality and quantity and creativity of the responses that we got, and the breadth of methods that are showcased there. And yes, I have presented from perhaps the more creative end, but researchers have had to be creative. It's been imperative.
Yeah, Dr. Kara, so we don't have any new questions. We have two good comments, but perhaps later on somebody might come up with a question further down the line. So the first comment is that the IPL has developed an interesting WhatsApp survey, and Patricia Nabuco has shared the link in the chat, so everybody can access that link. And it's the IPL share the manual and code for the WhatsApp survey that they created.
Yes, I think just to comment a little bit on how Professor Kara was explaining, this was an interesting example of the Immigration Policy Lab of Stanford. So they developed using WhatsApp a survey and using different softwares and code that can be replicable even for people that are not experts in computer science. So that would also be, as Professor Kara was saying, a creative and digital methods. So they were also working in collaboration with some local-based organizations providing services to migrants to understand what were the migrants' needs during the pandemic. So they would share these surveys with the numbers, and then when the person answered the number on WhatsApp, number 1 or 2, they had this software that would combine the answers, and then the researchers could analyze it. So this was another interesting example. Thank you.
But thank you. No, thank you. And I'm very happy, you know, if any of you have examples that you want to share, please do. I can pop you a link there to the stitched diary that I was talking about, in case you're interested to see how that can work. I think a lot of it is, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, the thing about different methods, a lot of it is to do with how we view the world, isn't it really? And terminology too. I mean, computer scientists talk about ontology as a way of naming and defining properties and categories of a subject area and showing how they're related. In qualitative research, people talk about ontology, which means by which they mean someone's worldview, how they view the world. So even terminology is difficult. You know, it's very difficult. People say one thing in one discipline and it means something different in another. But then that keeps life interesting, I guess.
Exactly. And perhaps somebody might have an example of a STEM or an example from the STEM disciplines later on that they might share, since there was a lot of interest from that end. And then a final comment from Adine states that the digital divide with the indigenous communities is so true. The most relevant pieces of knowledge we register are in environments far from the internet.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I know it's really difficult, and but also still interesting. I found an example from my Sage book. I was thinking about the computer science side of things, and the thing about computer science that I find interesting is they have many sources of data in a whole load of different formats. For data, they might use computer code, they might use discussions from online forums, they might use software design diagrams, they might use documents. And how do you analyze such a rich and complex and varied collection of data? I mean, those of us who just collect words or just collect pictures or just collect numbers have a much easier time. So they've started using, drawing on some techniques from the more qualitative side of things, like a technique called grounded theory, where you analyze by comparing through continuous comparison between all your different kinds of data to look for the patterns and find the links, and you write notes to yourself as you go to create a narrative, to create a story. Again, all research is told in stories. It's not particularly that, I'm using the word story, but that story isn't really an essential part. Perhaps that's part of my worldview. I kind of tend to see stories in a lot of places. But this has helped them to generate some really useful theories around topics they've been researching, such as how software processes form and evolve, how the process of developing software is managed and how it can best be managed, and how self-organizing agile teams actually do organize themselves and how they can do that better, and so on. That's an interesting one. I find an increasing number of crossovers between disciplines in these sorts of ways, right across the board, really right across the board. I need to look more at physics. That was a good question. I need to look more at physics. Anyone else? I'm nearly out of time. I've just got 2 minutes left if anyone has any burning questions, or we can go early to the break. I'm sure nobody would complain.
Amazing timing, Dr. Kara.
So I think we can thank you, Helen. I think you're sort of an activist in the best sense of the term, connecting people all over the world online who share their methodological solutions. I also like your statement that all research is told in stories. But I think it's really important that your work is sort of a catalyst, and the whole pandemic is sort of a catalyst for more transdisciplinary methods. I mean, through methodology, connect disciplines more. I have the impression, at least after your talk, and the creative part of your input will be taken up by Bill in the second part of our meeting today, and we're looking forward to that one too. So thank you very much, and a big applause for Helen, and have a nice break. In 10 minutes we will meet again.
Thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Bill has to say after the break. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll come back in 10 minutes, possibly 8.
Not right back, but we might slowly start nevertheless. Well, let's wait a minute.
I'd give it a minute.
Yeah.
They're all making tea. But what time is it where you guys are?
I mean, in Switzerland, it's
Because
5:20.
now, but like in South America,
It's 6 hours earlier. Like before, when they joined, it was at 4, it was 10 o'clock in the morning. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's several people joining. Now you see 11:20 in Ecuador.
Okay. I haven't pulled you out of bed super early for this.
Yeah.
But I may cut into your lunchtime, so I better. So is my audio okay? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, it's good. Okay, so we'll welcome back everybody. We're really grateful for your interest, and Bill or Professor William Gaber has the floor.
Okay. Yeah, let me set up my share screen and just say I'm really happy to have been asked to do this, though I feel like I hope that what I have will be of interest to you. Good Lord, I have a lot of open windows. But there it is. So I think it's actually quite amazing that I can be talking in London to an audience that's in Switzerland and South America. I mean, we've already said that, but it never ceases to amaze me. And so what I'm going to do is just try to talk about some of the stuff we do in my studio and hope that it will be relevant to your interests. I do not consider myself an expert in remote field work, but I do work that touches upon it, and I think we could share ideas based on the things I have to say. So I want to contextualize my work a little bit by telling you about who I am and where I work. So I am a co-leader of a group called the Interaction Research Studio at Goldsmiths University of London, which is in South London. It's a kind of a liberal arts college. And the Interaction Research Studio is a group of about, well, it varies in size. It's about 8 or 10 of us. And we come from a mixed design, technology, and social sciences, largely sociology background. And we work together and have been working together for a number of years. None of the people in the group are students. We're all postgraduate researchers. And most of our work is funded with grants from UK research councils, sometimes the EU, perhaps no longer, sadly, and occasionally with industry money as well. And what we do, the kind of research we do is a form of practice-based research in which we build kind of novel computational devices that explore what computation can be, and in a way, what people can be through the opportunities they offer. And so all these devices are usually quite unusual, they're quite playful, and we build them to a very high level of finish so that people can try them for long periods of time as if they were real products. So for us, field work comes into our work in two places, really, both at the beginning of a project and the end. So for instance, this is an example of a project we did a number of years ago where we worked with people in a care home setting. And at the outset of the project, we had no idea what we might design. So we spent a fair amount of time getting to know the setting, both by kind of ethnographic observation and interviews, plus some kind of intervention studies where we gave the people in the home things to try, bits of toys and technologies, just to see how they would orient to the things before going on and producing this device, which I will not say much about beyond saying that it is a kind of specialized, well, we called it the photo stroller, and it shows an endless stream of photographs drawn from the Flickr photo sharing website based on a set of kind of keywords that you can enter using the handheld device that she's using there. So the other time we use the fieldwork then is having deployed a device like this, we spend some time watching what people do with them and talking with them about it to get a feel for what they think of the device and what the device tells us both about, possibilities for new computation, but also more about their lives and their interests and what they're about. So another project in a way similar was we worked in a convent with a group of cloistered nuns over a period of time, where again, we had no idea what we might design, but after spending time talking with them from outside the cloister and actually getting enough access to do some photography inside, we designed the device shown here, which is called the Prayer Companion, and it shows endless stream of text, which is drawn from news feeds as well as social media feeds to kind of illuminate the current preoccupations in the world as a resource for the nuns' prayers of intercession. And so again, after we actually installed the device, we spent some time watching them, but more talking with them about how they oriented to the device, which I should say they liked a lot and used over a period of about 5 years. So that's kind of gives you a taste of the design we do, but also how and why we do field work to support that. So as widely prefaced here, what I want to spend the first chunk of time talking about is one of the methods we use to find out about people in their everyday lives, which we call cultural probes. This is not a new method. I invented, or Tony Dunn, Elena Pacente, and I came up with this method in 1999, I think. And the context was nothing like the pandemic in many ways, but it was like it in others. So we ended up, we had gotten funding for an EU project called Presence, in which we were planning to design technologies that would help link older people with their younger people in their neighborhoods. And we didn't know what we might design, but we did know that we would be working with 3 groups, one in Norway, one in Italy, and a third in the Netherlands in a large housing estate. So Tony and I flew to the 3 places and had like two or 3 days in each of the locations, where we got just the merest taste of what the situation was and who we were designing for. But as we prepared to leave, we realized we didn't know nearly enough to be able to really design well for the people in these sites. But we also knew that we didn't really have the funding nor the time to go back to the sites and make more extended visits. We were also really skeptical of traditional design methods we knew, like questionnaires or focus groups, because we thought that they would give a kind of access that would be too formal and constrained to really get beyond the way people present themselves publicly to actually understand their lives more deeply. So we started to think about ways that we could learn about them, and ended up thinking that it might be interesting to give people a series of kind of playful tasks that they could do, where the way they responded to the tasks would actually give us insight into who they are and what they care about. So, and that was really what was behind the cultural probes. That was the, kind of the moment of their conception. So we went back to our studio, and basically working with the people who were helping us, a couple of people helping us, we started putting together a bunch of materials that we would hand out to people. And we decided to package them together as a collection, so it'd be kind of like a gift to them. And in the end of the day, what we designed them to do, which is quite important in this context, was that we distributed the probes in person to people, but they could return all the materials using the post. So in this first study, the kinds of things we used, there were kind of 3 sorts of things we used. So we gave them a disposable camera on the top left with requests on the back for the kinds of pictures we wanted them to take. So this is a regular disposable 35mm camera, but we repackaged it with requests to take pictures of things like show us the view out your kitchen window, or show us what you're wearing today, or show us something ugly, something beautiful, something boring, something interesting. So quite open-ended and slightly odd questions. And we also left pictures at the end and asked them just to take pictures of whatever they wanted to show us. The other thing we gave out was a series of postcards, which had sort of evocative images on one side and fairly open-ended questions on the other. So things like, what's in this case shown here, it's what's your favorite device? We asked things like, what do you think of politicians? Or tell us a joke, or tell us what you like about your area. In the case of the Belmer, which is a housing estate in the Netherlands that had a very bad reputation. And for Peccoli, which is a really idyllic Tuscan town, we asked what they didn't like about their village, things like that. And we use the postcard because it's a constrained, really accessible form of communication that people, at least at the time, were pretty familiar with. And it also meant that we could, self-address the return and put a stamp on them, so they just put them in a post box to return them to us. We also gave a bunch of maps to people, which were cut out in the forms of unfolded envelopes, so they could be folded together and posted to us. And the maps gave various tasks. So we asked people to map things like where they went to be alone, or where they went to be with other people, or where they would like to go but can't, and things like that. And various other tasks. For instance, we asked them to map on a world map where they had been in the world, which was actually really interesting for the three groups. And the last thing we did was a kind of blank photographic album where we asked people to attach their own photos, their own printed photos, to tell us the story of their lives. And that was quite amazing because people trusted us with their photos. They sent us their photos in these albums with notes about what their lives had been like. But of course, that was a very open-ended question. So they responded in a variety of ways, everything from their complete life history to much more of a story about their current lives. And that was fine because we didn't want to over-prescribe. So I'm not going to say a lot more about that. Oh, I will show you some of the returns, sorry. So this is an example. This is just to give you a taste of what we get back. This is an example of a postcard where we asked, do you have any good advice you could give us? And this person wrote, yeah, the best advice I ever got was never to interfere in other people's problems if you're not asked to. Don't take things belonging to other people, and to stop smoking because it's not good for your health. I think he had seen me having a cigarette. This is a map where we asked people to put red, yellow, and green stickers in places where they felt afraid, cautious, or safe. And we got a richly annotated, this is one of several versions of the Belmer, the housing estate in the Netherlands, showing places you had to avoid because of junkies and thieves, and places you had to be careful for much the same reason, and saying that the only place you really feel safe is inside, preferably in your own flat. So a kind of scary return. And we also got hundreds of photographs back showing life in the areas, in the three areas. And this one, interestingly, is a photo of a woman in the Belmer, this housing estate, who's tending her garden. And it tells a totally different story than the story about junkies and thieves. It points out that there's a really much richer kind of life and places for enjoyment in this area that really undercuts the narrative we had heard about it being unsafe. So at the end of the day, we had, this is a terrible photo, but it's really old. We had hundreds of photos and dozens of maps and postcards and so forth. And we didn't really analyze them. I'll go back to that a bit. But what we did was live with these returns, and through that build up a picture of the three sites in a way that was really foundational for the design work that followed. Based on that study, we published a paper in a magazine called Interactions, where we described the method in some detail. And that paper has actually become very popular. So cultural probes within my field, which is largely interaction design and human-computer interaction, has become really a fairly well-established approach to doing research, which is interesting. One of the things we pointed out, though, at the end of the paper was that the strength of the method is that we had designed the material specifically for those people and then in that environment. And by doing that, we had created a kind of personal conversation with our participants that would be really hard to create if you kind of standardize probe materials. We believe that probes need to be fresh every time. So I want to go through quickly another probe study, just to give you more of a taste of the possibilities and how this might work. This is a study we did some years later where we were engaged in a project where all we knew is we wanted to design new kinds of technologies for people's homes. And this was a while ago, so technology in the home was kind of new, digital technology in the home, and most of it was kind of recreating workplace applications. So we wanted to get beyond that, and we wanted to explore more deeply how people think about home and how they live at home. So in this case, we made a dozen different items, which were some ways similar and some ways quite different than the first one. So we again included a camera with requests for pictures. This time we went maybe a little bit further and asked for people to show us a secret collection or take a picture of the spiritual center of their home, or simply take a picture of something red or something at 4 o'clock on a Sunday. So we became aware that part of the value of the camera was not how people responded to particular requests, but just in getting them to take pictures of their homes in a way that they wouldn't if we asked them to take pictures of their homes. We get surprising views and surprising nooks and crannies that kind of cuts beyond the kind of formal view they might tell us otherwise. Another thing we included was, I don't know which to choose really, perhaps this one, though it's not a great picture. We included something called a friends and family map, which sociologists use, where they ask people to diagram in various ways themselves and their closer and further friends and relatives to try to get a feel for their social circles. But we interfered with their, oh, actually that's this one. We interfered with that task by giving them kind of visual metaphors to use as part of the task. So we gave them things like a diagram of the solar system, or a picture of a beach and shore going up to woods. Or in this case, we gave them a diagram of Dante's heaven and hell with all the various forms of saints and sinners, and asked them to map friends and family to that. And that actually turned out to be really interesting, because people tell you things in that context that they might not tell you otherwise. Another thing we included was house rule tags, which we encouraged people to fill out and leave around the house, which were the kind of implicit rules you have in living in the home that might be as obvious as, you know, do your dishes, or they might be much more kind of the unspoken rules, like don't talk about politics at the dinner table. And we left it open and let them choose what kind of rules they gave us. And the final thing we gave them is something we call a dream recorder, which is a really simple digital recorder as found in greeting cards, which is repackaged with instructions that when you wake up from a vivid dream, you pull the tab on the end of the back, a light lights up, and you have 10 seconds to tell us about your dream. And then the recorder shuts down and you can either give it back to us or not. And again, this was interesting because although we got maybe fewer than half of the people returning dreams, the dreams turned out to really capture those people in a really unique way. It was very interesting. So that's a kind of example, again, of the sorts of tasks we give. And there's a few things that I think work well about the probes. So one thing is by giving lots of varied tasks, we give people the chance to kind of respond to those that they find interesting and to ignore those that they don't really want to do or find difficult to do. And we encourage that. We tell people they don't have to do everything. The other thing about multiple tasks is that they can be done over time. People could do one day and wait a day or two and do another and so forth. So they're really flexible in that way and sort of in keeping with what Helen was saying. Many of the tasks we give are very open-ended, but they're also sometimes absurd or really odd. You have to fight to interpret what we might mean when we give a task. and how you can tell us about yourself through the kind of constraints of the task. And that's really interesting. And, you know, it's not like an easy questionnaire you fill in. You actually have to grapple and think about how to work with the task to talk about it, talk about yourself. And equally, when we get our returns, when we get returns from people, yes, we have to fight to try to make sense of what people are trying to tell us. So again, the returns are lots of scrolled messages on maps, pictures of people doing random things around the home. In this case, it's a glass with writing on it, telling us what people heard in their home, a picture of a messy drawer, a tag saying wring out dishcloth. None of these things are really easy to interpret. And that's kind of also something we consider an advantage. They force us to work to try to make sense of what, not just what people are trying to tell us, but what's there for us to find about the people and their lives and their beliefs. And they resist analysis in a very real way. It's very hard to take a bunch of household rule tags and kind of categorize or analyze them, certainly, you know, in any kind of quantitative way, to make general statements about the household rules people have in their homes. And instead, they work very differently for us, I think. So we tend to use the probe returns to give us a kind of texture of people in a household. They give us a kind of multidimensional painting or access into people's lives that we can then start to get to know people. And indeed, we're looking at a set of returns, you start to feel like you know the people in a way like you do friends, because you visited their home, you've heard odd remarks from them, you've seen things that they've said, the ways they respond to tasks. And you get, it develops a feeling of empathy between you and the people you're studying that can be quite powerful. The other way we use probes a lot is to find landmarks among them. We find particular returns that for us are really quite striking. And because our business is designed, you know, we're really interested in the returns that can help us think about a new design direction to explore. So for instance, this guy's lying in front of his fish tank staring at his fish just spoke worlds to us about a way of engaging in the home that is not about doing chores or tasks, but is in allowing your mind to wander and allowing yourself to kind of relax and fantasize within the home. That's just an example. So I don't know how am I doing on time? Because I could stop here and take questions.
I think that's the good idea, because we can still continue the second part of your presentation and make a quick stop and see whether there are any questions. I mean, what I take from your first part is that you penetrate without being intrusive into personal, private lives, intimacy, everyday lives of people, even their dreams. Which I think is interesting. Of course, we will have to discuss for what disciplines this is. It's the same question as we had with Helen, for what disciplines this might work. Does it work for the mathematician, for instance? This will be interesting. So what disciplines are really prone to the probes? And then I think the playful, inspirational impulses are really very important, and you again go for the haptic, the audio, the visual strands to inspire your participants. I have one or two questions, but let's see what other people would like to ask you.
So maybe while everybody's gathering their thoughts and writing the questions on the chat or turning their camera on and be brave enough to ask the questions, maybe I'll jumpstart the conversation by also asking about the process after you receive the probe sets back. So how do you make sense of the data afterwards? So a little bit about the process after you receive the process. How do you do the sense making out of something that is so creative?
Typically, we do it by, I mean, it's actually nothing magic. And nor is it terribly methodological. We do it by looking at the probes often together and just discussing what we're seeing in them and speculating about them. So, you know, as Helen would say, we tell stories about them, and we tell stories that we know that may kind of over-interpret the data. We're quite playful about them. It's often a very playful method. And we give ourselves license to tell stories beyond what we know, because we know we're doing that. We're aware we're doing that. So what's interesting about probes, one of the things I like to say, is that what you get out of them is kind of storytelling, but it's storytelling that's grounded in empirical fact. So there is one, you know, they are an empirical method. People are actually returning these things, but then when you go work with them, you start to realize that you're telling stories that may go beyond. I think that playfulness is actually also really important to the whole kind of approach, because one of the things that Yvette said is that we do get access often to things that are quite intimate from people and things that are surprising. And I think that comes about because we invite people to play with us, to explore new ways of talking about themselves and thinking about themselves. And often that means that, and we also actually work very hard to undercut any kind of, you know, sort of status as professional researchers and make it clear we're just kind of people talking to them. And what that does is often get people to respond. So a certain amount of humor and playfulness can often invite a kind of playfulness and humor back, and often that can be really kind of revealing of the people behind it.
I think that this playfulness and humor is really central at the moment when you choose a disposable camera in the age of smartphones. You know, I mean, everybody has a phone at every moment. I mean, not everybody, we have the digital divide, but many people also in Latin America. So I guess that's the main impulse, to give them an additional disposable camera.
Well, wait till part two of my talk, but that's right. We are really resistant to using smartphones for photography or for pros in general, because one of the interesting things about, for instance, the disposable cameras is you can't edit or delete the photos. And that means you get there's a kind of candid quality to what people give us that I think would be potentially really disrupted by the ability to take 5 shots until you get just the right one. You know, there's something about that kind of casual nature. Equally, you know, phones have their own culture around them. They're their own thing. They have a lot of baggage with them that we try to move away from that and try to create something really new. I should say you know, I've shown you a couple of examples of probes we've done. There's been lots of probes made by lots of people in the world, and they vary widely. So, I mean, another kind of interesting thing about probes is they are very open-ended. So you can design probes that are basically very much like questionnaires. They can be very focused. They can be, you know, you could consider a questionnaire as a subcategory of a probe, I guess. But we tend to do things that are a bit more, well, I don't really like saying creative, not like questionnaires, a bit more open-ended, a bit more confusing, but there's a big space in between that you can work with them. Equally, people do all kinds of different tasks. So some people, you know, have worked with getting people to make, you know, probes that get people making physical objects for them, or annotating pottery. You know, it's just, the world is wide open. And the last thing I'd like to point out is that the probes are certainly in the original, well, the versions I've shown you, do not rely on the internet at all, you know, and in fact, the only thing they really rely on is the post. And so insofar as physical materials can be sent around by post, they provide a way of interacting with people. It's quite, you know, quite isn't so concerned with accessibility, although of course post itself is variously accessible in various places.
Yeah, that's really clear that it is analog. And I think what is really important in the probes is that it's not just sort of a grab bag, eine Wundertüte, but it's really systematic questionnaire. I mean, sort of a questionnaire, yeah.
Well, I mean, again, it's in your hands. It's as systematic as you make it. So I think we try to there's a kind of balance between being playful, creative, a bit strange, weird, but you know, you want to be in this, you want to be in this middle zone where things are creative and fun, without getting nonsensical. And so some people, if students try probes, sometimes they design things that seem fun to do, but just have no chance of giving you something that would actually tell you much, you know. And on the other hand, other people make probes that are really much like questionnaires, and then you think, well, what's the point, you know? So there is a kind of balance between those two.
A question has come up, Rocio.
Yes, so we have two quick comments. The first one is from Edine Cavazzi saying that it's very interesting. Thank you. It gives tremendous insight on material culture, and it also generates the ingredients towards effective narratives. And there's also a comment from Leticia Vargas saying that she loves the idea of using the post for data collection, because we just talked about the problems of collecting data from regions where internet connection is poor during Helen's presentation. So it is time to also think about traditional communication tools as an effective and interesting way of conducting research. And then we have a question from Vanessa, and she starts out by saying, thank you, it's always incredibly inspiring. And the question is, how is the physical object important in the narrative process?
Okay, that's a few things. Let me take it back to front. Well, okay, so the physical objects, there's a number of things with the kind of physicality of probes. And one is that they provide a different way for you to interact with things than stuff that's just online or just on paper. So writing on a glass, filling out a tag, all those things, they're even writing a postcard is quite different than, you know, working on an A4 sheet of paper to fill out a questionnaire. And that physicality is part of, you know, it allows people to interact differently. So for instance, putting stickers on a map is quite different than actually trying to draw a map or trying to write on it or whatever. You know, it's a different kind of thing. The other thing about the design of the probes is that they allow us to kind of express care and to demonstrate care in our research for our participants. And again, this chimes with what Helen was saying, that we want our research not just to be fun, but to be kind of equal. So you know, there's something about questionnaires which is often kind of selfish. So you spend a little time writing a questionnaire and people then demand people fill it out. And it's like there's not much in it for them. Whereas a well-designed probe is kind of a gift to the recipient that invites them to give back to you. And that's part of the rationale behind the design we use. I don't know what else. I think there's a new comment here saying postal connections are also rather poor, and I get that, you know, in part because I've been trying to post stuff to the States, and it's not great there now either. I think one of the things I was thinking is, though, I'm kind of not super happy about the idea of online probes. I have speculated about the possibility of being able to send send like PDFs of probes to people that then they could print out and post back to you or something like that. So there may be ways to at least help with some of the accessibility problems in that way. But that would, you know, that takes discussion, right?
Some more questions, live questions? I mean, we can just continue with the second part, but what would be a research? What would be a research project, a concrete research project you have had to fulfill with the probe method? So, what research question would you have tried to answer in a concrete project you had to do?
See, this is one of the reasons I talked about our studio to begin with. For us, our projects are almost always very open-ended because that's how we rate them. You know, we submit proposals, they get accepted. So we're in charge of our questions, you know. And so the projects we set up are usually around situations and issues, but they're open-ended in terms of what we might make. And so for us, probes are often most useful when they give us a really wide picture of the context for our design so that we can then come up with ideas for what might be interesting in those contexts. But it's possible to use probes for more specific questions. And just, unfortunately, this is more a thought experiment, but I have done work with a sociologist at Goldsmiths who is interested in medical treatments. And we put together a proposal, which is sadly unfunded, but I still think it was a good enough idea to talk about here. And that had to do with looking at the emergence of a new treatment for AIDS, HIV. And in particular, it was something called PrEP, which is a prophylactic treatment to prevent transmission of HIV by people taking antiretrovirals before having sex. And that was just beginning to happen within the UK, and it was very controversial because it seemed to undercut safe sex messaging. So we were really interested in, and in a way, there's some parallels to what we were saying about how these methods can illuminate things like medical studies or perhaps technologies or engineering, possibly physics, by looking at the human elements that surround the core science. So we were interested in, we knew that the PrEP worked, but we were interested in the factors that would lead to take up or refusal of PrEP amongst the communities. And probes seemed like a really good way to study that. So that was to be a much more pointed kind of study, but which I think probes, but unfortunately wasn't funded. So it's all fictional. Might not.
Okay.
Helen has some comments.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm really allowed to ask a question,
Yes, you
but
are. Yes,
seeing
you
as
are.
there's space, I would like to. I'm really interested in what you're saying, Bill, about how it seems to me what you're talking about, one aspect of what you're talking about is kind of rebalancing the power balance between researchers and participants and making it a whole lot less paternalistic. So research is less something that we do to other people and we fix it all ourselves and they just have to answer our questions. So we just extract data from other people and then use it for our science. You're taking a very different approach. Can you just say a little bit more about that sort of power side of things? I'm really interested in that.
Yeah. Yeah, but I mean, we had some sort of cheesy metaphors we used when we first came up with the probes, where we kind of decided that we didn't want to be doctors. We didn't want to be people studying our participants and then prescribing to them what they should have. And we also didn't want to be servants. So we didn't want to be working with participants and having them tell us what to design and what they wanted. We wanted to work as much more equal partners. And if anything, we wanted to be slightly provocateurs with respect to them. So we did want to go in and make our voices heard and to kind of, in some gentle way, disrupt their notions of normality to try to start a different kind of, help them think about different possibilities with us. But to be honest, we don't tend to do what's traditionally known as co-design or participatory design. We tend to think of ourselves not necessarily as doing all the design with participants, but doing the design in a kind of conversation with participants. And the probes are a really good example. So we design probes in our studio that we think will be interesting and give us stuff that might, teach us new things. And then we give those to our participants, almost like we say something to them. And they work with them, and their returns is them saying something back to us. And we're all working to mutually interpret what we're saying might mean, you know? And then based on the probes, we usually come up with proposals, which in a way could be used for field work as well. Simple proposals of things that might be made that we bring to them, and then they discuss those with us, and then it goes on and we design something. The design themselves is like another they respond to. So I think of it much as a very dialogic process. And throughout, we're kind of selfish about making sure we can do things we're interested in, but we're very much trying to help our participants give our participants permission to understand that they are totally, equal partners. So, I mean, for instance, going back to the study with the nuns, we came up with the idea of a prayer companion, but in discussing it with them, they made it very clear that if they didn't like it, they wouldn't have it in their convent. And we were happy with that. That is how it should be. And so it was a really productive project just because of that kind of equality. In terms of the fields that probes are good for, just going back slightly, I think, we are very much embedded in doing things in the design way, but I know that probes have also been used by sociologists and social scientists for their work, and I think other fields like business management, other fields. So they kind of have a scope to go further than what we do, even though I'm totally in my own work in a lot of ways.
Okay, so now I think it would be good, and we're looking forward to the second part of your slide series.
Yeah, okay, I've warned you that this is a bit more of a grab bag, but there are a few other things I wanted to talk about that I think might be relevant, but you may have to work with me here. So the first thing I wanted to do is just kind of go on from probes and tell you about a more recent project, which is called Probe Tools, where what we've done is design devices that can be used in probe studies. And I'll just go through these briefly because they might be of interest. So I said that we use disposable cameras for our studies, but a few years ago, we realized that disposable cameras are actually becoming kind of more difficult to work with. They're harder to find, they're harder to get developed. And they also just seem old. They seem like old technology. They're kind of anachronistic. And at the time, we had already been doing lots of work developing our own digital devices. And we realized that with the new microprocessors like Arduino and Raspberry Pi and stuff, we can make our own digital cameras pretty simply within our studio. And in fact, we realized that not only could we do that, but we could make cameras, we could design cameras that other people could make. So we got some funding, and what we've done is design a series of cameras that are constrained and specialized for probe studies, and then published instructions for making them on a website so that anybody in the world can go on and order the parts and make their own versions of these designs. So this is the first thing we designed. It's called the Tascam, and it is basically just a digital version of the disposable camera. It has a small screen on the back, and as a researcher, you can come up with a bunch of questions you want to ask, put it on SD card, insert it in the camera, and when you use the camera, you use the buttons on the right and left to look at different questions. And when you take a picture, the picture is saved with the question that prompted the picture. So it's just a really easy way to prompt people to take pictures and then get the pictures labeled back. And this again is a camera you can build yourself, and right down to the case. So the case that's shown here is just made out of 2 sheets of paper that have been cut according to a template we described and folded a bit like origami to create the case for the camera, which I think is really cool. The other camera we designed is called the Vision Cam, and this is kind of different. So we were interested in how you can start to get, how you can start to do sort of the equivalent of videoing people over time while protecting their privacy, and providing something that might be kind of intriguing to watch. So these are cameras that are 3D printed. They're made to be really easy to 3D print and put together using the Raspberry Pi. And they use an algorithm that takes in the video and does a kind of time-lapse photography as it sees action in front of the camera. And then it does contour detection to generate what are kind of like line drawings, cartoons of the scenes, rather than show the full video. And the results of doing that, we think, are kind of really intriguing. So this is a video taken around a dining room table, and you can see people eating and passing stuff around to each other, looking at the camera. And there's kind of just enough there to see something about what's going on without, we think, really intruding on privacy very much. So here's somebody dancing in front of the camera. So this is sort of a thing that the Vision Cam does. And the notion is that people can leave those, for instance, in somebody's living room without actually intruding too much. And as an aside, what the camera is taking is always shown on the front of the camera, and there's a button that allows you to erase the recent clip if you think you have been intruded upon. So that's a Vision camera. And the last thing we designed is called the automatic interviewer, and that's something that allows the researcher to record a series of questions, and then the participant in the research later can take the device and listen to a question, and then they're given a certain amount of time to record their answer to that question. And they can repeat that and do that at will over time. And we use a certain amount of audio processing, both to manipulate the researcher's voice more for effect than anything else, but also to change the respondent's voice again to protect privacy, so that they can protect, they can answer without us having a voice recording of them. So those are the three devices, and I bring those up because people in the audience may or may not be interested in trying to make their own. If you are interested, you can go to protools.net and take a look and see if you're up to building them. The other thing that's on the website is a guide to making cultural probes, which is, it's not magic, but it's a set of advice that we've written up to try to talk a little bit about how we think about creating probe tasks and the kind of characteristics they have. It's not a how-to, it's not entirely a how-to, because that in a way shouldn't be done, but it is tips about a kind of approach or the spirit with which we develop probes. So you can take a look at that too. I'll just go on to two more things briefly. The other thing I wanted to mention, and this is where we get a bit grab baggy, is going back to the notion of using video and the shortcomings of using video for research. I'm reminded of very strongly of research that I was involved with in the late 90s, because I'm extremely old now, which has become newly topical. And this is work that was done on what was called media spaces. It was done at Xerox PARC, but also Xerox Euro Park, where I was in Cambridge, England, Toronto, and various other places, where people were starting to look ahead to what it would be like to work where you're connected, as we are now, by computational media and by video. But things like Zoom or Skype, none of that was around yet. The ability to push in video on the internet wasn't there. So what people did was to create analog networks where people can have video monitors and cameras in their offices and use digitally controlled switches to direct the stream of video in various places in the same building. So what that meant is I could sit in my office and I could use a bit of software, actually quite accessible software, and create a video connection with somebody somewhere else in the building. And that's fine. It was just looking ahead to video phone calls. But what we found out from living with this stuff is there was a lot more that could be done with video than just a face-to-face phone call. And some of these things might be interested in thinking about research. So one thing that we did was we had software that would allow us to make very short one-way video glimpses, which just meant I could press a button and look through your camera for 3 seconds, and then the connection would be broken. The analogy we used is that it was like looking in somebody's office just to see what they were up to, whether they're on the phone, whether they were open to a visit. To kind of, obviously this was done by consent because it raised its potential privacy problems. To help with that a bit, we played a short audio cue to alert people that they were being looked at. And of course, people could always turn their cameras off or move them to one side. But that turned out to be a really interesting way of keeping tabs on what was going on around the office without actually intruding on people. At the opposite end of the spectrum, some people also set up long, sort of always on office shows. They kept their cameras and monitors connected for months or even years so that they virtually shared an office with somebody. And what's interesting about that is if you do that, it's very different than a face-to-face conversation like we're having. Instead, it really is like living with somebody in a corner of your room. And you can spend long periods of time not talking to each other, not orientating to each other, but always with a sense of peripheral awareness of the other person and their activities available to you. We also experimented with cameras that that focused on desktops so you could see activities rather than faces. We used cameras in physical avatars. We mounted a camera in a mannequin for a public space so that people would notice it and kind of get an intuitive grasp of what was going on. We used a variety of mobile cameras and so forth. And I guess the reason I'm reminded of this, apart from being told, for instance, that Microsoft is picking up on this research, is that it just is a reminder that video can be used in lots of ways that we don't tend to use it now. We tend to focus on things like Zoom, that there's things we can do with live video that go well beyond that. And the last thing I wanted to show you briefly was work that we've been doing lately, which in a way is an extension of that work. And it has to do with building simple communication devices to provide peripheral and emotional awareness to people. So this is a project called Yo-Yo Devices, where we're building very simple communication devices. And again, publishing instructions on the web to allow people to build their own versions really simply out of cheap electronics and household materials. We've released 3. We're releasing 3 at this point. We have another on the way. I'll show you 2 briefly. One is probably not super relevant for field research, but it's still nice. This is called the light touch device. And you're seeing a picture of my desk where I'm sitting even now. And that is a light touch device that I share with my mother, who is in California. And there's a little button on top of the device. When I press the button, one of the 2 LEDs in the device cycles through colors. When I find a color I like, I can press the button and that color appears on her device in California. And she can do the same back. So one light is controlled by me, one by her. It's super simple. It doesn't tell us much about each other, but what it does do is give us a real sense of presence. So my mother and I have been using this for about a month, and we send each other signals multiple times a day, just as a way of kind of saying hello and reminding each other of each other's presence. That's just a simple device, but it's fun. The other one that might be slightly more relevant is this one. It's called Speed Dial because it has a dial on it. And what it is again, there's a pair of devices. Each has a pointer. You use a button to turn a pointer to point at one of the segments on the dial that's controlled. And both devices point to the same section. So it's just a really simple way to pass a message to each other. In this case, it's suggesting activities for lockdown that you might, suggest to your partner. But it's equally possible to think about something like that being used as a kind of research tool that suggests activities to a participant that you might want them to do at a time. So you could, set up a set of segments that say, write a diary entry, send us a picture, record a sound, things like that, and use that as a way of kind of indexically capturing bits about their local environment. So I thought it was reasonable to end with that. And I think that's it. I'll stop there. This is kind of a summary of what I've talked about, but I thought I'd throw those onto the table too.
Thank you very much, William. Yeah. It's really taking us away from the digital and getting us back to the analog, which is really, I mean, very nice after so many months of digitalization, strong digitalization. So this is really interesting. Any more comments and questions from the public? In the chat, we don't have any, do we?
No, we do not have any questions.
Okay, good.
People are exhausted.
Congratulatory messages of how much everybody has been enjoying the conversation.
Thank you. No, it's fine. Well, we're almost out of time, but what would be interesting really is to talk more about the kind of research you guys are doing and to think about ways, you know, more specifically to your research that some of these ideas could be applied. So I apologize if I've gone on too long. But I think as Helen found with, you know, you really have to get into details of a project to actually make useful suggestions.
Yeah, but you definitely gave us several impulses for, I mean, independent of disciplines and exact research project, impulses for animating the creativity, the ideas needed in these times of pandemic crisis. I mean, that was it for me. It was pretty clear also that creativity, arts are omnipresent in both of your presentations. I mean, the self-made video camera filming the dinner is a good example where it like steps into art also. But for me, it's really moving away from the digital to a certain extent, because it's really symptomatic that Helen divided her talk into the digital and the creativity talk, and Bill took up the creativity. And what I like in Bill's part is that he remains pretty much unimpressed by through his probes by the pandemic, because he has been into this for 30 years and it's very solid for his research. After experimenting for such a long time, I mean 3 decades or 2 decades, no 3 decades, yeah.
2.
Yeah, 2, okay. So we really hope that this event inspired you to be brave and step out of the conventional empirical research and fieldwork modes in all your disciplines, and take a new perspective on this. For instance, the live video Bill just presented us. In the digital realm, of course, we will continue to work, but also in the analog one. So in the physical one, in the haptic one, in the visual one, I think that for me was quite clear in both presentations. And I think they went well with each other, because Helen was like on a more general mode, and Bill really showed us how you can in details change your conventional attitudes of doing fieldwork or of doing research with the probe tools or the probe kits or sets, etc. So any other comment, a general comment on the event? Yeah, it's what Helen says, up to you. So we thank you very much for participating, all of you in Latin America, in Switzerland or elsewhere. And thank you again, Helen and Bill, for your insights. It has really been, for me, it has been a next step of how to see the future of research. Thank you.
It's a privilege.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And feel free to be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We can see if in the future, perhaps we can organize a follow-up to this presentation and see if maybe we could even do a workshop with people's projects to work more hands-on with our audience. So hopefully we will stay in touch and we will see the two of you either, virtually or in person in Switzerland at some point.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay.
That would be great. That would be really good. Thank you for having us.
Okay. Thank you
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Leticia.
One thing we don't have to download the chat, right? Because nobody requested.
Now you can stop the recording or